what do you expect when you do some kind of a translation? So therefore, let's focus on the languages. Now, I would like to start this reflection on language with an example that I can draw from my home. So it was a couple of years back. Till then, I didn't really notice seriously that I was in my village at my home. So my mother was preparing. It was during the festival because I live in Bangalore. So our village travel largely happens during some ritual, some festivities which are there. I'm sure a lot of you who live in Delhi also do that. You go back to your native places because you have some function or something. So when we go there was a strange remark by my mother, who is now around 75 years old. Okay, for whole of her life she has lived in that village, and she made this strange remark. What was this comment? It was about early in the morning, and as you know how strict the people are when they are involved in the ritual. ऐसा करना है, ऐसा ठीक करना है, ये गलत है, ये चर्चा होती रहती है घर में. तो उस समय में my mother was saying, जिन्होंने भी इसको किया हो ना, अगर वो मेरे सामने है, मैं उसको उसको, I mean, she wanted to beat him up. I mean, कौन बनाया है इसको? Now, if you look at this sentence, कौन बनाया है ये सब चीजों को? बना के हमें थका देते हैं, right? Now, if you look at this sentence normally, when I looked at my mother, it was a very strange thing to me. It is not the first time that my mother said it. I mean, I know that statement that my mother keeps saying for a long time. And this was never to stop that ritual. When she made that statement, she never intended to stop it. In fact, she has been making it every year, year after year. She continues to say the same statement. But she never meant that, a ritual nahi karna. In fact, my mother would insist that we do this ritual appropriately. अगर उसमें कुछ गड़बड़ होता है ना, जब हम बेंगलुरु से जाते हैं तो बहुत गाली वाली मिलते हैं हमें, क्योंकि हमारा सोच उतना ठीक नहीं होगा. हम क्या क्या करना है, घर की रिवाज हमें ठीक नहीं आता है, उसको सीखना. And she is very busy in teaching this to my son, right? So therefore, this sentence that she was making, if you read the sentence standalone, क्या होगा? What do you guys think? Have you not heard such sentences that your mothers or somebody at home doing it? But if you read this sentence, because I know this is my mother who has been saying, and every time she says this, but she is very serious, very busy in engaging in these ritual activities all the time. So this sentence certainly does not mean what she is saying, right? Rather, it is opposite. In fact, you don't even know what is the function of such a sentence. तो रिचुअल को गाली तो लग रहा है वहाँ, critique of ritual, if you want to use the social scientific language. तो ऐसा तो नहीं लग रहा है, but she is busy in doing this ritual. Then why such a sentence comes into being? So imagine, for example, I write a diary that I went to my village and so on, and I write about this sentence, right? When I write about this sentence, and somebody, after some time, it becomes an archive. Right? It is the source of history for somebody. And if they read it, how would they understand that sentence? Now, it would naturally, certainly lead to, a kind of communication, which is something drastically different than what it was supposed to be. Right? So, I know, for example, my mother has no problem with the ritual. It was just a passing reference because she was tired, or it is too burdensome or something. As a passing reference, she is actually making that statement. But in fact, she would love to do that ritual. In fact, if that ritual does not happen, she will be very upset. So she is more serious about it. But the structure of the sentence is such that after 10 years, if someone picks up my diary and reads it, there is no other choice other than saying that this is against religion. I mean, you can actually build a story because she belonged to certain X community that is part of Hindu religion. These are oppressive structure, women are being oppressed, and her sentence is a reflection of the oppression that happened through these ritual structures. But in our experience of daily life, My mother has no such intention when she is uttering that sentence. Contrary, because she made that statement, if you say, आप ये सब बंद कर दो, कल से मत करो, अब बोल के दिखाइए ना एक बार घर में, कर सकते हैं क्या? आपको पता है उसका कॉन्सिक्वेंस क्या होगा? आप गाली नहीं खा सकते हो. तो I mean that means there is some kind of a disguised context within which we read our texts, sentences. Therefore, one of the most important, this example that I took brings you to one of the very central aspect of what we were supposed to think and reflect about. Now, in any language situation, whenever language gets used, now, for example, I come and ask you this question. The question is, did you have food? Did you have lunch? It's a very simple question. And you, आपने खाना खाया क्या? So you can answer me back, हाँ हमने खाना खाया. नहीं तो नहीं हमें खाना खाया. And if you are a typical Indian, then आप इतना simple yes no answer में आपकी कहानी खत्म नहीं होगा. एक बड़ा लंबा उसके पीछे थोड़ा मसाला वगैरह होगा और काफ़ी बड़ा कहानी है. ऐसा क्या हुआ ना, वो मैं मेट्रो से निकल के यहाँ से आ रहा था, ऐसा हो गया ठिकाना फला, बीच में काफ़ी चीज़ें आएगा. क्वेश्चन तो एक सेंटेंस था, खाना खाया क्या आपने? तो ये एक, this is what happens in the communication. In order to this communication to happen, one of the most fundamental requisite is, मैंने जो आपसे पूछा, जो हम पूछते हैं आपको समझ में आना चाहिए, right? And जो आप बोलते हो वो मुझे समझ में आना चाहिए. There has to be a common understanding between me and you in order to communicate. So by asking a sentence, आपने खाना खाया क्या? I am actually communicating something, right? Now, you could answer this question because you are understanding something out of it. So there is this communication from my side, and there is an understanding that is eliciting a response from you. Now, there has to be this two-way process of communicating and understanding. Agar, take that sentence, did you have lunch? Okay. Now ask this question, try answering it to yourself. What did I communicate? आप सबने हाँ बोल दिया कि हमने कुछ communicate, मैं communicate कर रहा हूँ और आप respond कर रहे हो. So when I am saying that I communicate, what did I communicate to you? What did you understand? Now, though certainly all of us know it is commonsensical that of course I did communicate something. See, instead of asking it in English or Hindi, if I would have asked Nimdu uta aita, you wouldn't even know. Some people might know, it might be Kannada, you might take guesses, but you wouldn't understand. There is no communication happening. If I am asking in Hindi, if I am asking in English, you understand what I am communicating because we have a shared world, right? But the question remains, what did I communicate? Can anyone try answering this question? What did I communicate and what did you understand out of it? When I say, did you have lunch? Yes, Sangeet, you want to say something? No, that's fine. That's fine. Those are all surrounding. But if I say I communicated something by asking a sentence, it might have evoked something, maybe conversation, whatever. No, it could be, but what, I mean, so then you have to get into an assessment of why did I ask that question? See, did you have lunch is a question. And if you say that I am communicating a sense of concern, now what you're trying to do is you're actually removing the focus from the sentence to the person who is asking, his intention. Now, but there is much more fundamental than my intention, because that sentence is communicating, independent of my intention, it is asking, did you have food? So if I say I am communicating, what do you think that I could have been communicating? There could be intentions. I might be, it could be a sentence which is part of the wit that we use, language. I mean, all these are different layers that you can add. I'm not going there. But if you say, वाक्य से कुछ आपको बोला जाता है, तो what is that being communicated? Now, not that none of you understand it. There is great difficulty to answer this question. It is not a very easy question to answer because this requires certain kind of understanding of how we share languages in order to understand. See the linguistic universe. There is a world of languages. So imagine that if that sentence would have been in Mandarin language, for example, none of the Indian languages, you might have been thinking, मैंने क्या पूछा होगा? It might have still invoked some question in you. तो इन्होंने कुछ तो पूछा है, लेकिन क्या पूछा होगा? क्या पूछ रहा होगा? Or you might be even asking, वो क्या समझना चाहता है? But you will not get any head and tail of if I am asking something in Mandarin. Probably a Chinese would understand it because it is Chinese language, but it is not a language for me and you. Therefore, we share a lot of things in a given language. Now, when we say we communicate something in a given language, it means that there are certain things, not so much about the meaning, etc., etc. There is much more complicated things associated with the language, and I wanted to bring it to your attention that how language functions. Okay, and this question we will still not answer. What is that which is being communicated, etc. We will come back to that question, but we will focus and reflect on some kind of a question. Let's take the usage of a very simple kind of a noun. Okay, Billy. Right? Now, we can use something like this. Right? So, how many sentences can we create around this word cat? Billy के बारे में. बिल्ली एक प्राणी है. Okay, मेरे घर में एक बिल्ली है. Right? So, you can keep on adding. बिल्ली अलग अलग तरीके की बिल्लियां होती है. बिल्ली की रंग अलग है. Now, if you go on, you can actually keep on generating using Billy as the reference. Okay, you can keep on building any number of sentences. Right? Now, so therefore, whenever you want to use a language, one of the most fundamental thing that you require is a reference point through which we can actually build a conversation. So here, cat is an object. Okay, cat is something that exists in the world. Therefore, it's an object. And you have a name, C-A-T. Hindi mein Billi. Okay, so this is, cat is a referent and the C-A-T word is reference. So the word, there is the C-A-T points to an object in the world. Because there is an object in the world, so you have the reference towards that object. The word cat points towards that object. You can actually navigate in this world. You can actually build conversation in the world around that for a long number of sentences. बिल्ली का रंग ये है, बिल्ली वो करती है, उनके घर में 2 बिल्लियां हैं, उनके घर में 3 बिल्लियां हैं, बिल्ली बहुत सुंदर है, मेरा बिल्ली बहुत इंटेलिजेंट है, this is a dumb cat. I mean, you can create any number of sentences, and these sentences are possible because there is something which is the object in the world, which is a noun. So this object has a reference which is cat in language, which, to use the stylistic language, the sign. The sign refers to this object called cat, and because of that object, you can make sense of this object. How do you make sense of this object? You make sense of this object by describing what that object is doing. And all these sentences are true. मेरा बिल्ली का नाम है टामी. ठीक है, this is a true sentence. Okay, मेरा घर में बिल्ली थी. You can say that. मेरा घर में 2 बिल्लियां है. All these are true sentences, and this is called, these sentences that we are using So there are two words which are very fundamental in understanding a language, the sense and the reference. Right? Reference kya hai? Billy. There is a cat. And when there is a cat, and cat के ऊपर आप कितना ज़्यादा sentences अलग अलग तरीके से उस ऑब्जेक्ट के बारे में बात करते हो, because that is part of your experience. बिल्ली तो सब जानते हैं, कौन नहीं जानते? तो मेरे अनुभव में बिल्ली ऐसा करती है. तो all are true and valid sentences. You can't say they are false sentences. You can even dream about a cat and generate any number of sentences. All of them are called sense, and this is with reference to this particular object called cat. Like that, you can create any number of things. Chaitra, there is this person with this body. Like that, you can talk about morning star. You can talk about evening star. There is rabbit. So there are so many nouns in this world for which there is a sign in the language. And those are called references. And this is all about noun. And using these references, you can create any number of sentences that you could imagine in this world. So there is sense and reference in any language use. And when I say, did you have lunch? There is reference to lunch. Did you have dinner? There is reference to dinner. Now around the dinner, I told you, you can say, I had dinner. I didn't have dinner. Or you can tell an entire story about kya ho gaya. Or you can say, like the Sangeet, you can say, I might be concerned about him, whether did he has. Now all of them are making sense of the reference. So हम दोनों बात इसलिए कर सकते हैं, we can communicate with each other for this reason, simply because there is reference which are objects in the world, and these objects are converted into some kind of a science in the world. Right? So there is a question. Now every language has these references. Around these references, sentences are built. That is called sense. Right? But then there is a component saying that we understand. Right? Now, what does it mean to say we understand? So for that, one of the easiest way to imagine a particular kind of experimental situation. Now imagine for the first time, in the absence of dictionaries, in the absence of computers, imagine somebody who is Hindi speaking lands in, say, Karnataka, right? And we both have to converse with each other, right? Now, the cat, which is Billy, right? In Kannada में उसको बेक्कू बोलते हैं. Dog is nai. You know, these kind of things are there. How do you know that the reference that I have for this cat here in the language and what you are saying, can they be matched? Because let's say both of us have to talk about the cat, and you have come from UP, Delhi, and landed in Bangalore, Karnataka, some part where nobody knows Hindi. There are no dictionaries. Okay, there are no translators available. None of them are available. Then we need to converse with each other. We need to communicate with each other. When we are communicating with each other, how do I know this object? बिल्ली है, तो आप आएंगे तो वहाँ बिल्ली दिखेगा आपको. बिल्ली बेंगलुरु में भी है, दिल्ली में भी है, आपको दिखेगा. दिखने के बाद आपको you have to build a conversation because there is a common element. So they use the word bekku. Now, but there is difficulty for somebody to assign, how do I know that वो जो बात कर रहे हैं, that is about this object. How do I know? There comes a question, right? There is a terrific difficulty in terms of relating जो a cat जो object है, उसमें language में आप हिंदी में बिल्ली बोलते हो, दूसरा language में this object, can have a Hindi, a Kannada word for it. How do you know that these two words in Hindi, which is Billy, and Kannada there is Bekku, both of them are referring to cat? Now it becomes a very difficult issue for somebody who first time goes and interacts in such a way, because you have to see any number of situations where whenever there is this belief that you see, and your Kannada speaker, native speaker who is there, is using this word Bekku. And you have to keep making this enormous number of situations wherein he is saying, and therefore, probably the reference to this Kannada word refers to cat, this refers to cat, the object in the word. Until and unless you do that, there is always a possibility of doubt that it could be coincident. Because every time when you see cat, probably, it is also outside his house. So he might be referring to something else. So you have to ascertain that what is he referring to is about this particular object called cat, which is there, and you run into problem. Therefore, there comes the question, ये meaning क्या है? So this Kannada word, because you know in Hindi इसको बिल्ली बोलते हैं, and you wanted to assign a Kannada word exactly the same meaning, you have to arrive at it. How do you arrive at the same meaning in another language becomes an extraordinarily difficult job. Now, you know, because you know one language, you have cat as a reference, and there is sense in the sense that you can use it in different way. आप हजारों sentences के ऊपर बना सकते हो. So the reference हो गया, or then you travel to another place, unknown language, then the object is something that you have is visible, and then you have to actually get a meaning. Now, how do you ascertain? You have to actually create any number of situations where you speak with a Kannada speaker whenever there is the cat coming in front of him, and then ascertain whether such a object called cat has this X as the word. There is a reference, right? This is a situation where the languages are not known. But what if the object that you are interested in explaining is simply absent there? Imagine you are building a conversation and you wanted to communicate about an object, but it is simply not there in that place. How do you do that? Okay, अब pictures दिखा, जैसे मान लो bread पकोड़े, right? There is, but see, there is an additional difficulty because this is not the native language for you. हिंदी वालों तो मान लो आपको राजस्थान जाते हो, थोड़ा हिंदी समझ में आएगा, वहाँ आप काम चला सकते हैं. You go to Canada where they don't understand this. How do you say this? But that object doesn't exist in that place. Yeah. You know the object, but in the place where you are going, if that object is not there, how do you communicate? Yeah, but it will be a different object. That's a good scenario. So let me make another case. Okay. Now this is something very real because see, if you travel to northeast after Guwahati, see, you don't see crows in that place. Whole of India, you travel everywhere, you have crows. But if you cross northeast Guwahati parts, go to Shillong, you don't see crows. Okay. Now, उनको आपको कौवे के बारे में बात करना है. ब्रेड पकौड़ा तो ठीक है, बना सकते हो ब्रेड के, वो कैसे, मान लो आप अरुणाचल में कोई मिशिमी निशी ऐसा कुछ कम्युनिटीज के बीच में हो, अब कौवे के बारे में उनको दिखाना है. आज की कहानी छोड़ो, आप यूट्यूब में कुछ दिखाएंगे वो सब छोड़िए. तो हाउ डू यू ट्राई कम्युनिकेटिंग? तो अगर कौवे की नियरेस्ट रेफरेंस अगर दिखाओगे, वो कौवे नहीं होगा. Yes, Shashak. हाँ, so you can do all that. जैसे ब्रेड पकौड़ा बना सकते हैं, जैसे पेंटिंग बना सकते हो, size. You can use all of the what? References to make sure even if that object doesn't exist, because if object doesn't exist, doesn't mean that you cannot communicate. Otherwise, if that is the demand, when people study black holes, क्या वो जाके ब्लैक होल के अंदर जाके देख के आए क्या? अगर कोई जाके देख के आ सकता है क्या? They will get burnt. You can't even go. So you can talk about, communicate, but there is a point that there has to be a reference around which you have to build the story. Right? उन्होंने बोला कि ब्रेड पकोड़े हम बनाएंगे. तो बनाने के लिए the person who is unknown, he has to see what kind of material is necessary in order to make bread pakoda. Or in the way that, if I take your example, then we have to put in huge amount of efforts in figuring out कौन सा size की birds है, उनकी colors क्या होता है, पहले similarities लाके बाद में उससे फर्क क्या है, because वो ये महीना नहीं है, वो ये नहीं है, वो नहीं है, तो वो क्या है, because you have to give some picture. कौवा क्या होता है, so you have to give some kind of a picture around it. So it comes to a point that if you want to actually talk about meaning and its allied reference, you would know in this example and in bread pakoda example, if you say, the meaning emerges out of not simply one word. Right? So the cat is a simple example because there is an object, but normally in our conversation, if you want to say something, in order to draw meaning, you need to have a lot of things in the background to give you this idea, to develop this idea further of how we use it. अब सब लोगों को आरती पता है, आरती जिस घर में रिचुअल होता है आप आरती करते हो, right? Now what does doing आरती involve? ठीक है, एक उसके लिए एक प्लेट है, हाँ उसके पहले एक पूजा प्रकरण होता है, एक प्राण प्रतिष्ठा, कोई भी हो, अलग अलग जगह में, राइट, बट इट इज अ प्रोसेस. एक आदमी होता है, उसको ऐसे करना पड़ता है, उसमें मंत्र या गीत गायन होता है, उसके बाद में प्रसाद होता है. द मोमेंट यू टॉक अबाउट आरती इन्वोक्स एन इमेज इन यू. हाँ, वो आप ये बात कर सकते हैं, अलग अलग आरतियां हैं, वो भी बात कर सकते हो, लेकिन आरती एज ए जेनेरिक टर्म invokes a lot of images, which includes the fire, kumkum, haldi, prasad, puja, गीत गायन, मंत्रोच्चारण, जो कुछ भी हो, उसकी laundry list आप बना सकते हो. So आरती as a word, the moment all in this classroom here, now you know it's a combination of lot of things, right? So one is fire, one is kumkum, haldi, puja, bhajan. All of them put together, you have something called Aarti. Right? Imagine you are translating Aarti to English. What would be the translation look like? क्योंकि आरती is the most common word, no? हमारे बहुत सारे टेक्स्ट में, पोएट्री में, जो हम लिखते हैं, कन्नड़ में भी हम आरती यूज करते हैं. ओके, साउथ इंडियन लैंग्वेजेस में आरती ही होता है और कुछ नहीं होता है. तो इसको अगर हम इसके बारे में अंग्रेजी में लिखना है तो क्या होगा आरती? कैन यू ट्राई समवन इन गूगल? यू कैन ट्राई इट आउट. एनी यूरोपियन लैंग्वेज, हम पूरा पूरा इंडियन लैंग्वेजेस में आरती मतलब क्या होता है? एक कम एक ज्यादा, लेकिन मोर और लेस द same story. There is an image that gets invoked in you, right? When you translate, what would be a translation to Aarti? Huh? Okay, now take this flame sacrament, form of ritual कर दो. Form of ritual तो translation नहीं होगा, description होगा. Okay, translation, fire sacrament. तो उसमें ये सब आता है क्या? So there are different answers, but this is very interesting things. The Aarti is the name of the ritual, right? This name of the ritual has a particular reference, right? And it derives its meaning because there are a lot of background ideas. And because you hear this word Aarti, The moment you hear the word आरती, all of you had an image. आरती क्या होता है, उसके आगे पीछे सब एक आता है. But when we translate, let's say we call it fire sacrament, flame sacrament, okay? I mean, even you call it abracadabra, doesn't matter. Because if the moment you hear this word, would that invoke all that you know about Aarti by reading it? वो नहीं आएगा, आपके आंसर तो वो सिद्ध हो जाता है. Because you translate Aarti as a word to some other things because we wanted to say. But now let's come back to this question that we started with. When we translate it, what is the purpose of our translation? हाँ, whether message or not, but आरती ये होता है. हाँ, लेकिन अगर तो मैं अंग्रेजी में पढ़ता हूँ, यूरोपियन नॉवेल्स पढ़ता हूँ, मतलब द पर्पस ऑफ रीडिंग देम इज आई वांटेड टू नो अबाउट देम ना. उसके अलावा और भी कुछ पर्पसेस होंगे, लेकिन दुनिया में अलग अलग लोग अलग अलग तरह से रहते हैं. जैसे मैं हिंदी की प्रेमचंद की कहानियाँ हम पढ़ते थे, बच्चे स्कूल में हम थे, तो हिंदी में आई मीन वो क्या एक पर्टिकुलर रीजन है उत्तर प्रदेश या पंजाब के आसपास में, वहाँ की जिंदगी कैसे होता है उसको हम समझना चाहते थे, राइट. उसको इसीलिए उसका प्रेमचंद, जयशंकर प्रसाद, मैथिली शरण, इन लोगों का कन्नड़ा ट्रांसलेशन होते हैं. हम कन्नड़ा ट्रांसलेशन इसलिए करवाते हैं कि उस जगह के बारे में हमें थोड़ा जानकारी मिले, लोग वहाँ कैसे रहते हैं, उनकी कष्ट सुख क्या होता है, ये सब चीज़ें हमें समझना चाहिए. अगर ट्रांसलेशन जो आरती के एग्जाम्पल में आपने दिया और इनकी फ्लेम सैक्रमेंट करके हमने कर दिया, जो आरती करने से जो भाव आपके अंदर निकलता है, अगर वो नहीं आता है तो ट्रांसलेशन करें क्यों? यस. No, we will take it as it is. There is an important point that he was pointing out. आपका नाम? Rohit. Rohit was pointing a very important point and saying that there are limits to our communication. We will see whether there are really limits or is there any other problem. That's a question that we need to address. Okay, but the point is, उनके वहाँ वो नहीं है, आरती नहीं है उनके यहाँ, ठीक है. तो therefore, no matter what you do, उनको आरती मतलब you have to do something else other than finding another word for them. क्योंकि जो कुछ भी हो उनके यहाँ वो अलग अलग जगह में जाएगा. यस. See, if, for example, if I give you, there are other places where in English you have plenty of alternatives for the same phenomena. No, I mean, see, this is the general point about language, not about just Indian languages. Every language will have, for example, see, there are people where, so in English and French region, the nuances at which they speak about snow, we don't have so many words. I mean, they describe snow in so many words. All of them are same, like Mitra, Bhaskara, Surya, Aditya. In the same way, they also talk about snow in different way. So therefore, there is a general property to the language, saying there are situations where if they have more richer experience, they have richer number of words to describe that phenomena. Don't make it as a very unique thing to Indian languages. This, I mean, synonyms exist depending upon their cultural experience, and this is true irrespective of which language in the world that you are saying. At the maximum, you can say, for example, languages like Sanskrita would give you tremendous, repertoire to look at it. That I am willing to buy. But that doesn't mean that having multiple possibilities to talk about the same object is unique to Indian language is not the appropriate conclusion. हाँ, that is true. सूर्य के लिए हमारे पास इतना सारे choices है, अब उनके पास sun एक ही शब्द है, वो ठीक है in this example. But in terms of snow, for example, you can talk about different things. The different communities have different things that they consider their priority. Why it is their priority? हमें sun क्यों priority है? उनको नहीं है, ये हमारा प्रॉब्लम नहीं है. That's how the world is. World is not going to listen to us. So it develops in the way that it wants to develop. But coming back to this question, yes. ಕನ್ನಡನಾ? ಭಾಳ ಒಳ್ಳೆದಾಯ್ತು. ಹಾಂ. No, instead, let's ask this question. See, this is like jumping quickly to find an answer. Now, what we have not started the session and translation yet. We are only in the process of saying, no, wait. Before go, that's a solution to a given problem. But the point is, do we really understand the problem before going to the solution? So I am at the characterization of the problem level. Let's see whether that is a solution. It could be, it may not be. That could be one of the possibilities, or it may not be a possibility at all. We will come back to that. We will come back. Let's first think about language first. Now, whether it is Kadagulla Kavya, Mante Swami Kavya, Krishna, Madheswar Swami Kavya, I mean, all these kavyas are very interesting poetry. Now, we wanted to translate to English or any other languages, we have some problem. Now, in order to translate them, let's first understand nature of language itself and then come to translation. So now we are at the level of understanding the idea of language. And let's not hurry to solve the problems now. We have another one full day to solve the problems that are required, because we really don't know whether that would actually force us to take that route to solve a given problem, right? Now, one of the points that I was saying, like the way Aarti, now coming back to this example of Aarti invokes, yes sir.
Synonyms and things. This is a pertinent question about the synonyms and Indian languages having maximum number of words, where we need to understand the nature of the Indian languages and especially Sanskrit when it comes, and the other languages which are mostly conventional languages. So in a conventional language, it is decided that you have to call this as a hand. That's all. You can't ask questions why it should be called hand. It's more of object specific language. You have a name for this, it's chair. But you can't ask why this is chair. That's the nature of it. There may be some history behind it, but for that you have to dive deep into where from it originated, whether it is from Greek, Latin, or Lithuanian, or some primitive language, what could have been the root sound there. This whole idea of root sound, it's there in every language, but in most Indian languages, it is more systematized, and in Sanskrit, it is fully systematized. And Sanskrit and most of the Indian languages, which are directly or indirectly having some connection, I will not say derived because that will lead to more controversy, so are connected with it. So you find most languages are not object specific language. For example, like if you have the word, sharira for body, and you have more than 100 words for sharira, and each word defines a property of the body. In a sense that if you are familiar with your own language or Sanskrit, you are not only just using the word to communicate, but you are becoming aware of the whole science of it. Suppose in Ayurveda, And you look at like when you were translating any Shastra or particular technical text, say medical science text has to be translated into say Indian languages. In English you have the word body, but Ayurveda physician, if you go to Charak, Sushrut, Vagbhatta or any other text, they will not translate, use the single word for body everywhere. It will change. If the context is like if an Ayurveda physician is dealing with a deteriorating, aging body, they will use the word Sharira. If they're dealing with the growing body, they will use the word Deha. If they're using the static body, they will use the word Kaya. Because each word is derived from a particular root sound and it is describing what it means. So our languages are property based language. Therefore, the whole idea of synonym in other languages, in conventional languages, is a word for word. You replace it. Of course, there is also context. You have to choose in other languages also. Context is there. It's not free from context. But here it is maximum. It is more contextual than textual. So one has to understand this, in which context the word is used. And if you concentrate on these properties, say I can give you some example, like a very famous example which I give because I deal with children and then explain them the beauty of Sanskrit. What is the very popular word for hand? Hasta. Do you know why it is called hasta? Can you imagine what would be the root sound from which the word hasta comes? The word hasta comes from the root sound has. Has means, what is has? Hasana, to laugh. Then you will say, what? This is not an appropriate word. Should be used for mouth, which is laughing. But you have a word hasta coming from the root sound has, meaning to laugh. That is what his rigid mind will think. But here, Sanskrit, the whole design is such that it makes you aware of what is your psychological state, what happens in you when you are smiling or laughing. So what happens when we smile? There's a joyous moment, you become elated, you become, you open up or you shrink while smiling. You open up. So has actually means khilna, to open, to blossom. That's why you can very appropriately have a sentence in Sanskrit, Pushpam hasati, Pushpam vihasati. And any European mind will translate it as the flower is laughing, smiling. How ridiculous! All your Vedas, Upanishads, Gita, look, what is the language? Flower is laughing, but khilna, blooming. The same way, you can take all other meanings of opening, extending, stretching, expanding, extension. So any word in English or any meaning connected with this. So hand is called hasta because you can stretch it, expand it, extend it for doing all actions. Elephant has a trunk which it uses for doing its work. It stretches, extends on all directions. So it's called hasta. So elephant is called hasti because it has a hasta. It's very interesting journey if you just contemplate on Indian words and Sanskrit words to understand why certain thing happens in a certain way, the properties. It makes us aware of the whole science behind it. So here the idea of synonyms word for word doesn't work. The whole context works. That's what I wanted to say.
Next step was I was moving towards that. See, if you hear the description, come back to our conversation. Now, see, there is one of the very crucial important where we started is to look at the reference. Because there is a reference to object, something in this world, you can actually create any number of possible sentences to talk around it, which is the sense, right? Now, once you start going further, you realize that this reference, when you actually move between one linguistic to another linguistic universe, there is this question of meaning that comes into being. So there is a relationship between meaning and reference, becomes suddenly very crucial for the discussion, because if you don't ascribe correct reference through meaning, between different languages communication is impossible. So we took the example of Billy and looked at it. And then we went around in order to look at how meaning comes into being in general in the ordinary language use, because this meaning is very crucial in order to assign the reference to something in the world, which I will come back to. He actually added a very brilliant examples of the references. We will come back in this language. So you need a lot of underground ideas, background ideas. Now, which in English, there is this word called topos, which they use. So in the sense, meaning of a given particular word, when it evokes something, some image in you, because you use language, because through language you understand something, because it evokes, you need to look at a cluster of ideas together through which actually a particular kind of meaning comes into being. Right? Now, the example of Aarti was taken because Aarti as an image. If you say fire sacrament, you can't say what Aarti is, but in order to make Aarti, there is a whole range of background process of doing puja, Gita, Nartana, Bhajan, to whole ritual process. So half a dozen cluster of ideas actually come and sit below. Now, one of the difficulty in this, like the Sampadananda's example, these were brilliant example. Now take very simple thing. In dictionary, if you go, Deha and Kaya, right? I mean, it appears as though you can use interchangeably. But it doesn't get used in that way. When to use what? Now, so there is an element that people of a particular linguistic community know when to use what. Right? Even the Hasna, Rona, ये सब चीज. For example, you have heard Ananda Bashpa. Even though it is crying, but it is Ananda Bashpa. It takes you, put you into a completely different kind of a context. So therefore, the context that he was referring to is this cluster of ideas within which the meaning comes into being. So you need to attach. Aarti क्या होता है? आरती का reference कहाँ है? So in order to get like the cat that we have, the complicated example would be to use Aarti. So you can use the word Deha. All of them have a reference in the world, and this reference comes into being because there are a lot of other background words. So it is surrounded by a range of background words, background ideas. And all these ideas pooled together, will actually emerge, there emerges a meaning. Right? Now when you have to translate Aarti, if Aarti has to evoke the same kind of meaning, say for example, आप हिंदी से कन्नड़ा में लिख रहे हो. Now, I have Kannada words for it, but I can very simply, I know from which cluster of ideas, यहाँ जो आप हिंदी में describe किया है ना, from which cluster of ideas I can take and put this word Aarti into which cluster. Then the meaning comes into being. Okay, maybe Mangal Aarti हम use करते हैं, Mangala Nirajana. But background idea में क्या होना चाहिए उसके, सारे clusters available है, references है उसको. उसके अंदर लेके हम यहाँ रखते हैं, ठीक है? But when I am taking it to English, now one of my greatest difficulty would be, I take this word Aarti, right? And where do I place it in the spoken community? I run into huge crisis. Because in Kannada, for example, when you are taking it from Hindi to Kannada, you have all the necessary background ideas. You have to just go and place this word and substitute something, suddenly the same meaning would emerge there. But when you have to take it from here to put it in English, in their experiential world, you have nothing which is mappable. Now, to give you an example, I'm trying to simplify this idea because this is going to play a very crucial role in understanding translation and their problems. To give you a simply, put it very crudely, now we are traveling from Aurobindo Ashram to nearest metro station, right? There are 2, 3 possible roads you have. The moment I ask you, let's go and buy a ticket to, let's say, Chandni Chowk, nearest metro station, you have a mental map in you, right? आप यहाँ से निकलना, कहाँ लेफ्ट लेना, कहाँ राइट लेना, कौन सा दुकान कहाँ आता है, साइन पोस्ट. So you have references on the way, and how to navigate is a picture that you have. Okay, so I am telling you to go to a metro, all this. Imagine that I actually tell you similar kind of port that you have to take in Venice, where you don't have train, but they actually travel in the waterways. It is almost not possible for you to create that kind of a cognitive map. Or the residents of Venice, when they come here, they cannot create that kind of a cognitive map which is required for metro. They wouldn't understand the head and tail of metro. Right? So therefore, one of the most crucial problem that is happening here when we are using in language, even if you belong to different linguistic community, a particular idea that you have, a single word, is not word alone, but it is backed up with the background ideas. And it is connected in a complicated way with the background ideas. Right? Now, the reference of a particular object is decided by the cluster of ideas, which are called concept clusters or topos, which actually tell you how to make sense of it. आरती के अंदर क्या आता है, क्या नहीं आता है, आपको पता है, राइट? और किस समय में, कॉन्टेक्स्ट जो सर बोल रहे थे, किस समय में आरती में क्या एडिशन करना है, क्या डिलीशन करना है. सो इट इज द क्वेश्चन ऑफ डीलिंग विथ नॉट द वर्ड आरती, बट द होल क्लस्टर ऑफ आइडियाज इन द बैकग्राउंड. Right? One of the difficulties when the arati is taken out from this cluster, when you are saying it in European language, not alone that it is taken, it loses all that is required in order to produce meaning. It is put in a cluster of ideas which has nothing to do with it. For example, we will take Bhai Sahab ka answer tha ki it is a ritual. It's a kind of a ritual. Now, the moment you know it is a ritual, then where do you place आरती in European languages? तो रिचुअल कहाँ डालना है यूरोप में हमें पता नहीं है. The only possible option is this cluster of ideas around worship. तो हम आरती को यहाँ से निकाल के वर्शिप के क्लस्टर, कॉन्सेप्ट क्लस्टर्स में लगाते हैं. लेकिन वर्शिप क्या होता है, उनके अलग कॉन्सेप्ट क्लस्टर है. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, इन ऑर्डर टू हैव वर्शिप यू नीड टू हैव अ क्रिएटर गॉड. तो हमारे यहाँ आरती के लिए गॉड की जरूरत भी नहीं होती है. आरती बनाते हैं तो कोई बच्चा, घर में बच्चा पैदा हुआ है तो बच्चे की कुछ क्रियाकर्म होता है, तो आपको उसके लिए भी आरती करते हैं, गॉड की जरूरत ही नहीं है. वहां तो डिमांड तो क्रिएटर गॉड है. तो उस वर्शिप, अगर वर्शिप होना है तो नॉट जस्ट दैट ही हैज टू बी क्रिएटर गॉड, दैट गॉड हैज टू बी आउटसाइड द कॉस्मोस. तो हमारे सारे देवता यहाँ शादी वादी करते हैं, यहाँ लोकली घूमते हैं, सब यहाँ पूरा लोकल है. तो उनकी जो गॉड्स जो है, देवता जो है, हमारे देवताओं के साथ हमारे काफी आत्मीय संबंध होता है ना. वेरी डीपली वी आर कनेक्टेड. मेरा कृष्ण है, मैं कृष्ण को बहुत प्यार से बात करता हूँ, मैं गाली देता हूँ, मेरा इष्ट देवता है, मैं कुछ भी कर सकता हूँ उसकी. I am not using it negatively. We carry a very different relationship with our gods. But there, that God is outside this cosmos. वो तो यहाँ नहीं आएगा. आएगा तो उनकी विल के हिसाब से कहीं आएगा, आपके अंदर कुछ रखेगा. So then you run into this problem. The moment Aarti gets into cluster called worship, it has all kind of background concept clusters जो आरती से कोई संबंध नहीं रखता है. But now the reader who reads this Aarti, in this place, the moment you put it here, now he makes of Aarti as a different entity which has nothing to do with the Aarti that में हम लोग जो करते हैं, जिस आरती को हम जानते हैं, उसके हिसाब से कुछ नहीं होता है. Therefore, when you look at Aarti as a word, its reference and its meaning, its background idea, all of them has to be placed in a particular manner in a context. The moment you introduce, उनकी experiential world में worship है, a ritual की context नहीं है. The moment you take an आरती and put it into a cluster, कहाँ रखना है, वो बहुत problematic हो जाता है. तो वो एक अलग आरती की इमेज बना देती है. उस इमेज से आप इंडिया को काफी गाली भी दे सकते हो. उसमें क्या होगा, वो होगा, ये मतलब कुछ भी कहा नहीं बोल सकते हो, क्योंकि वो गलत जगह में जाके बैठा है. Because we think that आरती is a word. You know, when we say context, what does the context contain? Context ऐसे फालतू में नहीं आएगा ना सर, डिस्क्रिप्शन दे रहे थे. बैकग्राउंड कैसा आएगा, देहा कब यूज करना है, काया कब यूज करना है. यूरोपियन लैंग्वेजेस में भी ऐसा ही होता है. जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल व्हेन वी टेक रिलीजन, नो रिलीजन, गॉड, चर्च, इंस्टीट्यूशंस वगैरह, उनकी एक क्लस्टर ऑफ आइडियाज है, उसमें रिलीजन का एक मीनिंग निकलता है. नाउ द मोमेंट वी ब्रिंग इट टू इंडिया, राइट, कहाँ डालना है इसको, वो वैसा चीज हमारे पास नहीं है, तो कहाँ लगाना है इसको. हम लगते हैं अच्छा ऐसा कुछ है करके, ये धर्म करके कुछ है, उसके अंदर डाल देते हैं. नाउ ये धर्म के क्लस्टर के पीछे क्या क्या होता है, वो काफी अलग अलग चीजें होता है. एज ए कॉन्सिक्वेंस क्या है कि रिलीजियस की प्रॉपर्टी को हम धर्म के ऊपर आरोप करने लगते हैं, तो रिलीजन काफी, आई मीन इट बिकम्स अ वल्गर एक्सप्रेशन. That's why, you know, when you talk about Hindu religion, it always looks like a very vulgar kind of a prototype. Because ऐसा चीज हमारे पास नहीं है जिसको हम जहां नहीं है उसके अंदर घुसाने के लिए कोशिश कर रहे हैं. So there is a problem with respect to what it refers to, what the object is being pointed to. So when we move across the cultures, when we use languages to communicate something across the cultures, one of the crises that we run into is that we don't know where to place these ideas, because these are not single words. This is, I mean, this is not like using something like water, where there is this, or using something like cat, where the object specificity can be matched very easily. Most of other things that we deal with are either associated with theories or associated with our experiential world. क्योंकि आरती के बारे में जो आप लोगों ने यहाँ डिस्क्राइब किया, उसके बारे में ज्यादा बात तो नहीं कर सकते. आरती बनाना आता है आप लोगों को ना, जो बात करते हैं आपकी अनुभव की दुनिया में है वो. इट इज नॉट लाइक द डॉग और द कैट विच यू कैन गो एंड सी, हाँ ये ऑब्जेक्ट है. आरती कौन सा ऑब्जेक्ट है, वो कहाँ रहता है ऑब्जेक्ट, आरती के विषय क्या होता है. ये क्वेश्चन पूछ लिया तो अरे भाई साहब ये क्या बात कर रहे हो, यू कांट. So therefore, one of the most fundamental issue that you must recognize, that when the ideas migrate from one cluster of ideas to other cluster of ideas, one of the challenge that we have is that you don't, in the absence of the cluster of ideas, there is something called indeterminacy of objects. तो आरती को इंग्लिश में, अंग्रेजी में बोलने में क्या होता है हमें कि we don't know determinately कहाँ इस ऑब्जेक्ट को मैच करें. सो दिस इनडिटर्मिनेसी ऑब्जेक्ट हैज टू डिफरेंट कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस. तो इनडिटर्मिनेसी में क्या प्रॉब्लम है, एक तो ये अलग जगह में जाएगा जिसका कोई संबंध नहीं होता है उससे. बिकॉज इट गोज देयर, इट गेट्स एक्चुअली स्टार्ट गेटिंग द शेप ऑफ व्हाट दिस क्लस्टर इज ऑल अबाउट. जैसे आरती वर्शिप के अंदर जाएगा, वर्शिप के अंदर जाएगा तो लोग आके पूछेंगे व्हेन यू आर डूइंग दिस, जैसे आपके घर में कोई नवरात्रि चल रहा है, शाम आरती चल रहा है, कोई पढ़ा वो इंडोलॉजी की सारे किताब होता पढ़ के वो आपके घर में आएंगे, तो अच्छा विच स्क्रिप्चर हैज सैंक्शनड दिस. तो आपकी माता जी से जाके कोई पूछेगा तो आपकी माता जी को ये क्वेश्चन क्या होता है, मतलब उनको समझ में नहीं आएगा. क्योंकि हाउ डज शी डू दिस आरती, बिकॉज शी हैज बीन डूइंग दिस, इट इज पार्ट ऑफ अ कस्टमरी प्रैक्टिस दैट वी हैव बीन डूइंग दिस नवरात्रि. वो कौन सा किताब में कहाँ, मतलब विच स्क्रिप्चर कहाँ ढूंढ के लाए. बट दिस क्वेश्चन does not come because that I am in Indian, it comes because Aarti gets into a wrong place, because if you have to worship, God has to tell you. He tells you how to worship Him. Now, because of that, you, and I mean, where has He told? He has told it in a book. but काफी सारी चीजें जो है वर्शिप की, वो सारे क्वेश्चन आरती के ऊपर उठाया जाता है. The moment it goes there, and you can ask all the questions which are pertaining to worship, which is not, जैसे आपकी मम्मी जी को कोई आके पूछेंगे कि वो कौन सा ये sanctions क्या होता है, they can't even connect to what are you asking. I mean, if you want, go and ask your mother such questions, and let me see what answers you get. It is almost not possible because they know how to do it. This is part of the experiential world. So therefore, language is not simply about dictionary translation. This is not about taking the word arti. Oh, whether did you get the correct word for arti in English? That is ridiculous. Because arti as an idea is less to do with this dictionary meaning, but it is much to do with what makes arti into arti because of the background idea, which is part of the experiential world. जो आरती बनाते हैं उनकी एक्सपीरियंस में ये सब चीजें हैं. क्या करना, आरती बनाने वाले कोई पूछते हैं क्या ऐसे करना, दे नो व्हाट टू डू, व्हेन टू डू, व्हाट टू डू, हाउ टू डू. वो कैसे करते हैं, क्योंकि उनकी एक मैप होता है करने के लिए एक्सपीरियंस की दुनिया में, रेफरेंस होता है वहाँ, the background, whole range of ideas determines the meaning to that. That's how it works. The moment you shift it, it actually distorts it and it damages it. Not alone that, it actually loses this original idea, the worship that you have, that also gets altered because there is a loose way in which you have to talk about worship. तो हमारे घर में इतना सारे आरतियां बनाती है ना, कौन से किताब में लिखा गया है उसके बारे में कुछ पता है आपको? हर चीज के लिए आरती बनाते हैं घर में, राइट? कौन सा किताब में है, किस भगवान ने बताया है? No, you can't even raise such question to the most ordinary practices like Aarti, because then Europeans will run into problem, because the Aarti becomes part of the European dictionary vocabulary वगैरह होता है. So then worship is like this, but normally, but there are religions where these things are not necessary. Example, आरती. तो आरती में, हाँ, जब आरती इन इंडिया में हिंदू आरती जैसे एक चीज करते हैं, उस समय में ये सब करने की जरूरत नहीं होता है. दिस इज मे बी करप्ट वर्जन ऑफ हिंदुइज्म. इन ओरिजिनल हिंदुइज्म ये सब नहीं होता है, कहानी निकल के आता है. So therefore, one of the major ramifications that we have is, we have a terrific ignorance in terms of how do we use language. अलग अलग language use के लिए अलग अलग तरीका है दुनिया में. European languages are very different, Indian languages are very different, they are significantly different. हर चीज अलग अलग है, but there is a fundamental way in which language functions with its communicative ability. There is a question of knowledge, there is question of experience, and all these crises of questions of knowledge and experience just get flagged in language. तो लैंग्वेज मुखौटा है, लैंग्वेज में दिखता है ऐसा, लेकिन चलता क्या है, वो लैंग्वेज के पीछे चलता है, because all this, because there is object in the world. If you are not referring to an object, imagine, for example, I use perfect language. I will take an example. Green dreams sleep furiously. Grammatically correct sentence hai. Green dreams sleep furiously. What will you do with this kind of a sentence? हरा स्वप्न कोई ट्रांसलेट कर सकते हैं हिंदी में? हरा स्वप्न गंभीरता मतलब ऐसा, I mean you can create such sentences हिंदी में भी, मतलब they are grammatically correct sentences होते हैं, लेकिन उस सेंटेंस से किसको क्या फायदा है, उससे क्या कम्युनिकेशन होता है दुनिया में? Those are not useful sentences. Nobody takes them as serious sentences. One can create any number of such sentences in languages simply because you know the grammar, you know the language, you can create that, but they are absolutely useless. If you say language is everything, everything could be solved by dictionary, etc., you can create any number of these sentences and show they are very unproductive. Therefore, what appears in the front as problem of language is not necessarily the problem of language, but it is the question of knowledge and experience at stake. And it becomes complicated when we start actually interacting with the cultures which are not ours. Not that there is another culture which is inferior or superior. It is simply because we wanted to communicate across the culture. When we are trying to tell the story, with each other, very simple thing like Aarti, which is something that most Indians would know. Even if they don't practice Aarti in their house, they would know. They would have seen Bollywood cinemas. They would have known all this. And this is something that you can't simply communicate because your translation would force you to take one word and find an equivalent of it. And then you go on to talking, are you faithful to the original? Really? Problem original ki nahi hai, problem equivalent ki nahi hai. If you want to say this is an object that you are referring to, the way we spoke about the cat as an object that has a reference in the world. So the sign has a reference to an object, and if you want to communicate that, then there is this cluster of ideas generates a meaning, and then you get the reference. Now, because of that, when you actually move across cultures, across theories, there is something called indeterminacy of objects. You fail to assign reference in determinate fashion. Because of this indeterminacy that you have in matching objects across theories and across culture, you actually distort. Not alone that you spoil the idea of arati by putting into the cluster of ideas called worship, you also damage to this idea of worship itself. In the same way, for example, religion को धर्म बनाने से धर्म की एक नया ऐसे मीनिंग निकल के आया है कि धर्म क्या होता है आजकल. See, I will give you an example क्या होता है. We have picked up this new language, that religion as dharma, right? वो हिंदी में तो काफी prominently चर्चा होती है कि राजनीति से धर्म को दूर रखना. तो हमारे यहाँ हमारे कुछ colleagues थे who were studying in the villages. They did, हमारे जो कविता जी है हम उनकी सीनियर कोलीग्स वहाँ काम कर रहे थे कुछ पंचायतीस में कर्नाटक में. तो वो आके इनसे पूछा एक प्रश्न, उनकी सर्विस कर रहे थे, तो पूछा कि राजनीति से धर्म को बाहर रखे क्या. तो देयर इमीडिएट रेस्पॉन्स वाज, अगर राजनीति से धर्म को बाहर रखें क्या अधर्म करना चाहते हैं क्या राजनीति से. Now look, this is how Indians look at this as a problem. And in fact, many would say राजनीति को धर्म से बाहर रखने से अधर्म बढ़ जाता है. Because they don't see dharma as religion. It is not their part of the kind of work. Not that we understand what religions are. I mean, that's a different question. But nonetheless, the moment you actually bring in some of these sentences and put it, it actually creates an abysmally, laughing kind of context. So many people think that when politicians in Karnataka during elections, that I can tell you, when they say, so there is a serious problem, so we should not mix politics and religion, लोगों को कोई problem नहीं होता है. The moment they say राजनीति से धर्म को बाहर रखना है, तो लोगों को परेशानियां शुरू हो जाती है. ये क्या है? इन लोगों को हमें क्यों वोट दें? अगर राजनीति में धर्म नहीं होता है, तो क्या होना चाहिए? Because their sense of dharma is doing something good. अगर राजनीति में धर्म का मतलब राजनीति में doing something good. अगर वो नहीं होता है, तो राजनीति ऐसे लोगों को हमें वोट नहीं देने चाहिए. काफी लोग ऐसे रेस्पॉन्स करते हैं इंडिया में. I mean, I gave you an example of what happens in Karnataka, who are elected panchayati members. Now, I am sure that is not very different from Hindi belt if you travel in Uttar Pradesh. अरे लोग ऐसे ही देखते हैं ना. अच्छा वो धर्म कर्म ठीक कर रहा है, मतलब what he is doing something reasonably good, अच्छा आदमी है करके. So this kind of damages. But in the meantime, हमारा न्यूज़पेपर में हर रोज, छापा जाता है धार्मिक संघर्ष. ये क्या चीज है? There is a conflict. Undoubtedly there is a conflict. There is something happening. उसको क्या बताएं? हमें उसके बारे में सोचना है. जब लोग पढ़ते हैं ना, मेरे घर में मेरे पिताजी है 82 years, ये सब देखते हैं, हर रोज न्यूज़पेपर पढ़ते हैं सुबह उठ के. तो हर रोज उनका एक ऐसा आइटम होता है कि ऐसा क्यों लिखते हैं, सब किसके लिए लिखते हैं न्यूज़पेपर में. But there is something, a deeper crisis, because one of the idea that newspaper publish news is to communicate something, right? Now, what we are trying to do today, nobody is forcing us to actually take, English words and write about your phenomena in this world. Right? आज तो हमारा खुद का लिख सकते हैं, but we have translated all this and put it into wrong cluster. Religion को उठा के धर्म की cluster में लगा देते हैं, आरती को उठा के worship की cluster में लगा देते हैं. As a consequence, neither worship is comprehensible nor arti is comprehensible. We're damaging that. Now, why I said this is a very important context, because if you understand how sense and reference, meaning and reference, and this cluster of ideas determining the meaning, which actually eventually leads to reference, is understood. This is how we use our ordinary language. Now, I drew it from the most ordinary conversation that we do. This is how language functions. Right? If you understand this, then there is much more that we can reflect upon. How do we make use of language? How do we make language more communicatable? And if we have to tell our stories and Europeans want to understand, we should actually make it facilitating to them. And we should also understand more of European language. Why not? We should. And in order to do that, what we should do is one important idea that I wanted to flag it, because that's a comprehensive picture of what we have today in terms of our most ordinary use of language. So what I have tried doing is I didn't invoke any serious theories of language, etc. But I just wanted to tell you, this is how we use language and this has consequences. So there is sense and reference, and there is this determinacy of objects through this reference. And most often in our communication, this determinacy of language is lost. This indeterminacy of objects. Where to place, कहाँ रखना चाहिए. क्योंकि जो अगर मान लो मैंने इंग्लिश में लिखा, now I wanted to make them understand what I am trying to say. So therefore I need to find out by saying in what way they will be able to understand is something is very important that we need to think. When I have to say this to Kannada audience, I have a different thing to do. When I have to say it to Hindi, there is a different thing. But when I am saying it to European audience, when I have to write about Aarti, what do I write? How do I write? So these are the questions that we need to dwell upon. As I promised you, for your question we will come back, and at the end of by the end tomorrow, we will see whether you have found an answer to the question that you raised in the morning, right? But this is a track that we will follow and see whether we will find an answer to this question. Okay, so I think we should stop because it is at 1 o'clock. Anything that you guys want to ask? Yes. Should I say something about this particular? This is a question that many people have thought since you have raised it in history. One of the brilliant historians, Quentin Skinner, has spent enormous amount of time thinking about how ideas change in history. There is this idea of language change and political change in language. I mean, he has written very extensively about it. See, one thing you must understand, that ideas change undoubtedly. Instead of changing, they expand the meaning. Okay, the core meaning does not change. You can draw references. There are very few exceptions where they lose meaning, and it happens. The only examples that you can give is religion and dharma. But most often when ideas develop, for example, if you look at the dictionary, Sampadananda actually gave you a list in saying their body has 40 words. Now, you can use that and you can expand its possibility enormously, right? So even Quentin Skinner would agree with this idea that the core meaning of the words does not change at any given point in time. There is potential to expand its meaning, and only in that way, if it expands, it makes sense to a particular linguistic community. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. So the core ideas will never last. For example, you can take very deeper ideas like the sovereign. From theology to the modern state, there is a consistency in the way the sovereign has evolved, including when you talk about popular notion of sovereignty to anything that you can raise, there is an extraordinary consistency. The core meaning is preserved. There is expansion around this core meaning. And what is that historians and political analysts do is that how it expands. Entirely catapulting of the meaning in very exceptional cases happens, but normally there is a trajectory. So I hope we can get into, this is a very interesting question. Plenty of examples, we can continue discussing on that. No, Sangeet, there is this. The core meaning of dharma hasn't changed except recently. Now, for example, in Dharma Shastra, what is the function of dharma? Right? In different disciplines and domain, it has expanded. But dharayati iti dharmaha still remains the same. Okay, you can even say the notion of Dhamma that the Buddhists talk about, But it has not deviated from the dharayati, because this dharayati, the very easily that you can wear. Now from there it has not moved at all. And the only corruption that has happened, if at all, is after religion and dharma has confronted with each other. Otherwise you can show perfectly consistently, you can map it. Exactly. So but the core remains the same, it doesn't change. And it doesn't change even in Europe. A lot of English words that you have, for example, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic origin. And you can actually literally track them and they don't change their character. So even today, in the modern nation state, the idea of sovereignty is not different from the Christian God being sovereign. No, there is no difference at all. There are a whole range of theories of sovereignty that you have depending upon which political theory that you subscribe to, what is the function, etc. But the core idea of sovereignty has not changed from the God of the Christianity. There is an extraordinary, and we use it in secular way. And whether you like, whether you not, when you talk about sovereign rights, how did you get such a right? The only way to understand is to know the notion of the sovereign, who is the God, who is outside the cosmos. Otherwise, you can't understand modern political theory at all. Not possible. Shashank, aap puchna. No, I mean, except Nyaya never has this equivalence of justice. That's for clear. That's a very 19th century phenomenon, right? But the Nyaya, for example, there is this notion of Nyaya Dana, is in contradistinction with the notion of Nyaya that the Gautama or Gangesha uses. That's your question. You can very easily show the function of Nyaya as a word, not just grammatically, but even functionally you can show the Nyayadana that in village that happens, the panchayats that we refer to, Kha Panchayat for example, there also there is invocation Nyaya, that there is a consistency in using. You can actually show that there is an expansion of the meaning. In fact, there is no change that has happened with respect to Nyaya, and the only change has occurred when Nyaya has been placed in the justice cluster, which is something that is very difficult because Europeans also, you ask this question, what is justice? I have not found a single theorist who answers that question. You talk about justice because there is injustice. What is justice? You can't answer that question. Why? Because it is the God who is just and he is unknowable. So no theorist that I know, whether Rawls, Nozick or Sandel, nobody explains what justice is. So, and it is, I mean, there are certain overlaps that people see, and I don't know, I haven't thought about it. But the earlier notion of Nyaya, Nyaya Dana, Nyaya Panchayati, I mean, they are completely consistent with the way that we use in our culture. So, I mean, I would like to have, there are indeed some cases where you can actually talk about. I will give you some examples. I mean, I do know some examples. I have to think about it more, but they're very few. Anything else? If there is nothing much, then थोड़ा खाना वाना खाएंगे, बाद में सोचेंगे. ठीक है? Yes, please. देखो इसको I will solve it in a different way. I will not take this route that you are taking. That's a problematic route to take. क्योंकि उसमें काफी problem है theoretically. वो क्या है हम बाद में बात कर सकते हैं. See, I can understand that the concepts, when you say concepts could exist independent of word, it is theoretically not possible. Right? ऐसा concept है दुनिया में उसका word नहीं है लेकिन concept है. इसका एक तरीका है to make sense of what you are saying. I have to understand first what you are saying. ऐसा कि आपकी अनुभव में है जिसका शब्द नहीं है, ये हो सकता है. Concept है उसका शब्द नहीं है. How do you know that there is a concept in the absence of word? You can't talk about it, right? हमारे अनुभव में है लेकिन उसके लिए एक शब्द हमारे पास नहीं रहा है. The first step, if you take, then your entire question formulation itself gets changed, right? हजारों चीज होता है दुनिया में, उसके लिए जब हमारा एक रिक्वायरमेंट आता है उस समय उसका डिस्क्रिप्शन निकल के आता है, right? So that's an important point. But if you think about like आरती is in the experience of people, उसके लिए शब्द भी है. It is word, आरती as a concept is word dependence. अगर मान लो शब्द नहीं था, बाद में शब्द आया, क्या होगा? इसको रख के अगर if you reformulate your question, then I can answer. Because this concept word dependent conception, word independent conception is a flawed idea. I can't answer that question. Because it is not possible. You cannot have word independent conception. Okay, it is forbidden. People like me, I mean, any good epistemology would actually kill that. So, क्यों define करना चाहिए आपको? Because questions, focus on your question. You want to know dance. You want to describe dance. Why define dance? Because definition has a different role. Why define it? You want to how to describe dance? Take any description theory that is available to you. हाँ उन्होंने ऐसा किया, भरतनाट्यम नर्तन किया, भरतनाट्यम में प्रारंभ में ऐसा किया, आखिर में मंगलाचरण था, ये किया, वीडियो रिकॉर्ड करके उसका वॉइस ओवर कर देते हैं, डिस्क्रिप्शन दे सकते हो. डिफाइनिंग क्यों चाहिए? डिफाइन करके क्या करोगे? Because you see, these questions are raised in a particular situation. Those questions have a specific reference and meaning. Right? That's why I'm refraining to even engage with those questions. You wanted to describe dance. I wanted to tell about dance. कर देते हैं ना? Republic Day parade चलता है, January 26th, and we love watching it. और कोई narrator narrate कर देता है वहाँ. उसका description है, मैं मेरे घर में बैठा हूँ, डीडी में पूरा दिखाया जाता है, हम देखते हैं, क्या दिक्कत है उसमें? वहाँ स्तब्ध चित्र आएगा, कोई मिलिट्री का आएगा, सब. I mean, क्यों डिफाइन करना चाहिए उसको? That's an action. Why do you want to define it? So you should ask your question, what is the function of definition? Definition, having a definition, what knowledge will it give you? Definition certainly gives knowledge under certain conditions. हर चीज के लिए definition से कोई मतलब नहीं है. But if you can reformulate your question about the word dependent, word independent concept को, अनुभव में है, शब्द नहीं है. If you think that way and re-ask the question, then probably I will be able to answer your question. Okay?